Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's office hours. My name is Robert Albright. I'm Director of Programs with the Collective Impact Forum. Just wanted to start off by saying thanks so much for joining us. We hope that this finds you and your loved ones, colleagues, community, and family members safe and in good health. This is now our fourth weekly chat that we've been offering as part of the Managing Change in Rapidly Changing Times series. And we're just really glad to have you join us. I know we've got some repeat attendees who have been with us the last few weeks and a few new names that I saw on the list as well. So really excited to have you join us. I know that everyone is coming into this call, myself included, balancing a lot and adapting between your work and personal lives. And just, we're really grateful that you're joining us, and we really welcome that you just show up as you are as part of this informal conversation. Before we go any further, we do want to take a moment to recognize the land that we are on. We'd like to acknowledge that this virtual coffee is presented and recorded on the traditional land of the Ohlone people, the Potawatomi, the Waccamaw-Siouan, the Coast Salish people, and the Duwamish people, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the Ohlone, Potawatomi, Waccamaw-Siouan, Coast Salish, and Duwamish tribes. So as part of these weekly office hour series, some of you might be wondering, where's Jen? If you had been here before, my colleague Jen had a conflict and could not moderate today's discussion. So I'll do my best to step into her shoes. But we've really been keeping these conversations casual, and we want to continue doing that this week. There is one caveat that we've shared before and we'll share again, that we don't have all of the answers. We know that these are certainly unprecedented times. We'll certainly bring our current ideas and thinking based on our experiences and conversations that we're having across the field. And we hope that these perspectives can help you out a bit. Before we dive into the conversation and I introduce the folks who are going to be joining me today, I did want to take a few minutes to orient you to today's session. So as we've done before, the conversation will run for 60 minutes. They're set up primarily as a Q&A between you all, myself, and then our three speakers. We have joining us today FSG Managing Director Faye Hanleybrown, and then two returning guests, our senior advisors at the Collective Impact Forum, Junious Williams and Paul Schmitz. So please do send questions, and we'll try to get to some of those questions that you sent ahead of time as well. We will spend a few minutes up front sharing a few reflections from the past few weeks, and then we'll turn to questions. You can put your questions in the Q&A box in the lower part of your screen. This is one thing about Zoom. It has both Q&A and a chat functionality. We would encourage you to focus most of your questions in the Q&A box. Certainly, folks might have just general comments that they want to have, or any technical questions you could direct to the chat box. We'll also be putting some updates around the session recording and things like that in the chat box. We'll be notifying you of this recording in an email that we'll be sending afterwards with the recording and the materials from today's conversation. You can also find a copy of today's presentation available at the link in the chat box that my colleague Tracy is going to provide there. So you can just click on that link. You may have to actually copy the text and then put it into your browser, and then you'll be able to download the file directly from a Dropbox folder. So the last thing, just on kind of process, and then I want to get into hearing how you all are doing. If you have any technical difficulties during the conversation today, you can ask for assistance in the question or chat box, or you can email info@collectiveimpactforum.org. The other thing in this season of giving each other grace, I've been trying to model that with my family and with my coworkers. We want to encourage you all to bear with us as well as we're transitioning to a new platform. This is the second week that we've been using Zoom instead of a different platform that we had used before. Nothing was wrong with the prior platform, but we're just trying to centralize the tools that we use within FSG and already have a lot of things that we're doing through Zoom right now. This is also good practice for us since we're using Zoom for our virtual field-wide convening in early May. So we're going to launch a poll in just a moment. This is a tool that we've used with the Collective Impact Forum team over the last few months to really just check in with each other. And it was created by my colleague Tracy, who's running the back end for this office hours. And we use this tool to help us kind of name how we're doing on the spectrum from red all the way down to gray. You can see some of the descriptions here. It's not just about how you're doing professionally, but it's also how you're doing personally. So we wanted to start, as we've done before, by asking you all via a poll that Tracy's going to launch now. So let's leave that open for just a moment. So how are you doing today? Choose one of these options. And this is helpful for us to just get a pulse of how people are doing today. Let's keep it open for maybe 5-10 more seconds. Great. Thanks, Tracy. If you want to close that out, I'll play back the results. Interesting to see. So 1% red, 23% orange. The vast majority, not majority, but the most popular category was yellow, 47%. And then it falls off from there, 16% green, 9% blue, and 5% gray. So sounds like a lot of, you have many things going on, or you're juggling quite a bit, which is not surprising right now. So before I turn it over, I did want to just share a sentence or two more about our speakers. I'm just really excited that we have another voice joining the conversation today, FSG Managing Director Faye Hanleybrown. Let me just say briefly a little bit about her, and then I'll also introduce Junious and Paul. So Faye's a Managing Director in FSG Seattle office. She has nearly 20 years of experience advising foundations, corporations, nonprofits across a range of different issues. She's done a lot of work, particularly in the collective impact space, and it's been a real joy of mine to work closely with Faye over the last 10 plus years that I've been at FSG. She's also done a lot of work recently around FSG's consulting and initiatives work around equitable economic opportunity. So we're just thrilled, Faye, to have you part of the conversation. For those of you that have not met Junious and Paul, Junious Williams is a senior advisor with the Collective Impact Forum. He's also the principal of Junious Williams Consulting, which is a firm that specializes in research, policy analysis, collaboration facilitation, program development, and assessment focused on increasing equity and social justice. And then Paul Schmitz builds the collective leadership of organizations and communities to achieve greater social impact through his roles as a senior advisor to the forum, just like Junious. And Paul is also CEO of Leading Inside Out. He's an author, a speaker, a trainer, and consultant whose work focuses on leadership development, collaborative culture, racial equity, community engagement, and results-based strategies. So what we'd like to do to get started is I'm going to pass the baton first to Paul. He's going to walk through just a couple of the highlights from sessions 1 and 2 in this series. Junious is then going to build on that from one slide that he shared last week, and then I'll invite Faye in as well. So Paul, why don't you take it away?
Great. This is kind of the on previous episodes portion of the show. And from the March 26th, I shared a part of a blog that I wrote that is on the forum that laid kind of 10 steps out for how collective impact efforts can think about this moment. The first is to be okay that you're off plan, that your performance measures and all of that to recognize that this disruption is not just about a 2-month period, it's much longer. And to be okay with the fact that you're going off plan, you're going off metrics, you're not going to build momentum the same way, and that's okay. The second is to be clear about what special needs are your intended beneficiaries facing right now, the people that you serve, the people that you work with. How are they being affected by both the health aspect of this, the economic aspect, the social aspect, and to make sure that you're thinking of their needs, not just in terms of what you do, but in terms of just generally what they need. The third is to think about what special vulnerabilities the populations you serve might face if they contract the virus, and to make sure, especially as we know that there's been racially disparate outcomes, to make sure that you're providing support to them in that. The fourth is to be aware of just if you or your colleagues or team members get sick. I just talked to someone last night. They were sick for 18 days with this. And so we know that it takes people out for a long time. What contingencies do you have in place if you or someone from your team gets ill? The fifth is to really reach out to partners and understand which partners are overwhelmed by demand or facing financial crisis, and how can you support them or advocate for them or help them at this time. The sixth is to understand what local system leaders need. And I've seen this in a few communities where collective impact efforts, because of their incredible assets in terms of facilitation, in terms of bringing teams together and managing them across organizations, all these skills and systems you have, applying those to the disaster release. On the seventh is really being aware of those assets and figuring out where else they can be deployed. The eighth is advocating for funders to release restrictions on grants, and a lot have been doing that, and that's great, but also educate funders on the needs you're seeing. If you're talking to partners, if you're part of communities, I was talking to a group yesterday that is struggling with its funding right now, and because they're not immediate needs, felt they shouldn't be talking to funders. And I was like, no, you should be. Like, your infrastructure is important. And just being really clear about making sure we're educating people. The ninth is understanding how you'll adapt your strategies and timeline to not lose ground once things settle. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. And 10th is just be empathetic and patient with everyone's pace and productivity. All of us are struggling with multiple things. If you're like me, I'm now a principal of 4 different home schools, and a teacher and a librarian and a cafeteria worker and a janitor on top of everything else. And we have families who have economic concerns, health concerns, lost opportunities, lots of things going on. So recognize we have people who are sheltering alone, people sheltering in places that are difficult. Be patient and empathetic, and don't necessarily expect people to be where they are, and always check in with folks. Let's move to the next slide real quick. Last week, I introduced a tool that my colleague Mariana Urquia created that I really love on strategy, Triage, which really is about looking at your current strategies and work plans. And I just spent 3 hours this morning doing this for the Community Foundation. What's still a priority? What's still relevant and continues forward? What can you pause and resume once the crisis starts to move into the new normal that right now it's just not appropriate to do, but you can pause it? What are new priorities and things that are coming up as a result of this crisis that you need to be working on that may have been lower priority before or are new? What don't you know enough about yet and just need to gather more data or more information before you know whether it can continue or not? And what are you just going to let go of? And I thought this tool, I've used it with a bunch of groups so far, and people I think have found this a helpful way to kind of sort through and understand that in the next 6 to 9 months, there's a lot of unknown. And we're going to be disrupted. My state, Wisconsin, just announced that our shelter at home just is going to go through May 26th, and that schools are now officially canceled through the end of the year. So we know this disruption is going to continue. And how do we resort and rethink our priorities? And then eventually we'll migrate back to some new normal in terms of the strategies and things we do. And so those are things we talked about during the first 2 calls. I'm going to hand it over to Junious to share some other work we shared last week from his presentation.
And one thing, Junious, before you jump in, I know Tracy on the back end is responding to some of these. Some of you may be wondering, hey, I'd love to hear more or see more about the Triage tool or Paul's comments. Check the chat thread, because you'll be able to access the links of these prior conversations, not only the slides today, but what's available from the last couple conversations. So just, if this whet your appetite and you weren't part of those, you can access that there. But
and the blogs, and the blogs are linked that have all the information as well. Cool.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Robert. This was one of the slides from the presentation that I did last week, and I guess the important points are recognizing that one of the things that these multiple crises that we're facing, both the COVID-19 crisis and all of the crises that pre-existed the pandemic, offer an opportunity to increase the spheres of possible work for a collective impact initiative. And part of what I'm trying to represent in this circle is, obviously you've got a lot of time, energy, and resources invested in your collaborative infrastructure and your pre-existing work. And it's really important that you think about managing and maintaining the collaborative during this period of crisis, especially while we're in the emergency phase. But also, I think it's important for people to recognize, identify, and use some of the collective impact infrastructure that you've built in terms of the emergency management, the ability to convene, to have, structures for creating contact lists. Much of the infrastructure that's been developed could be deployed usefully in other segments of the community during this period of emergency. In addition to that, though, the collective impact initiatives have spent a lot of time analyzing deeply the issue that's the focal point of their work, and have, in a rather deliberate way, kind of identified strategies that they think are going to help to achieve those population level outcomes. And this circle just represents it represents a desire to have people apply that knowledge and those strategies in the emergency context, because it may be that thoughtful, deliberative work that's been done can be a countervailing force to some of the kind of desires of people to respond quickly, but without that kind of prior thinking. That also applies in the next area of the concentric circles to the knowledge and strategies. We're going to stay in a period of emergency for a while. When we emerge from that, we're likely to go into a period of recovery and ultimately then a period of rebuilding. And so I think it's really important for collective impact practitioners to try to apply the knowledge and strategies that they have generated in whatever their substantive focus area is to the recovery and rebuilding. And then the final two concentric circles represent a more expansive and sort of global thinking about where we're heading in the long term as a result of this. And I'd make two quick points. We have never, I think, understood social determinants of health in such a practical and applied way. The interrelationship of all of these social and economic phenomenon have kind of intertwined and interacted. And it's a useful, constructive framework for people to step back, no matter what your immediate work is. It may be schools, it may be criminal justice, and to begin to think about social determinants of health and how all of these factors interact with one another, and the importance of all of us thinking not only about our silo of work, but the integration of that into all of these interactive areas of social determinants. And then finally, make the point that you've got to, and we're all going to need to recalibrate whatever our common agenda was as we move forward. And it's just a plea to people that equity needs to be the North Star of redefining the common agenda. And I'll conclude by making this point. The founding fathers got it fundamentally wrong when they created the nation. We're about to recreate this nation. And it's really important that we don't commit the same sins that we did in the founding of the nation with respect to displacing Native people, enslaving Black people, and denying women the right to vote and to participate in this society. And we're in a position where we've got a lot of lessons, and if we apply them wisely, we may come out in the long term with a much stronger, equitable nation that's meeting the needs of its people in a way that we haven't before. So back to you, Robert.
Thanks, Junious, and got an amen from one of the attendees on your comment there. And we're going to take the slides down in just a minute as we move to Q&A. So as folks have heard these comments, or if you have questions, you can definitely add them to the Q&A box. But I do want to bring Faye in while I have this slide up, because it definitely relates to something we've been talking a lot about, and with our clients and with other partners and colleagues, is around how collaboratives can kind of balance the short term, intermediate, and long term, and just there's a lot of things that are coming at people right now. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, Faye, if you want to build on this concentric circles visual. How are you seeing the unique role that collaboratives can play, and kind of holding that tension about what's happening now versus down the road?
Yeah, thank you, Robert. And it's just a pleasure to be with you all. Thank you for being on the call. And I really wanted to echo and build on Junious's excellent framework here. I think one of the questions that we've been getting a lot of, getting from many collective impact efforts is, how do we prioritize in this time, which is so uncertain, right? The day-to-day is uncertain, let alone what the future might be. And I think a lot of the struggles that we're hearing from collective impact efforts around the country, even around the world, is how do we balance the short-term response with our long-term strategies and our common agenda that we're really committed to. And I think these are really pressing questions, right? Because we are in a crisis. As Paul just mentioned, this is not a short-term crisis. We know it's going to last for weeks, for months, potentially for longer. And one of the things that we know too is that the crisis is going to be coming in waves, right? So right now we're in that first wave of the crisis, that immediate response, the crisis of response where many of us are sheltering in place. Some of us are moving towards the peak of the crisis. I live just outside of Seattle. In fact, I live about 4 miles from Evergreen Hospital, which is where the first COVID-related death was reported in the United States. So this has felt very close to home for quite some time. And I know that's true for many of you. Other communities are just starting to go into shelter in place and are just starting to experience that emergency response. But that first wave is the emergency response and how to deal with it. The second wave is really coming out of the emergency period and beginning that recovery. And then the third phase is sort of the post-COVID world. And we've been talking about this at FSG. Many are talking about restarting, right? Restarting the economy, restarting life. We fundamentally believe that it's not about a restart, that it's about a reset. And really, to echo Junious's comments, this is an opportunity for us to fundamentally reset the systems that have created the inequities that led to this crisis. And I think that that's something that is critically important for all of us to be thinking about, not just post-COVID, but right now and all the way through. And I think, as we talk about the collective impact structures and collaboratives, collective impact collaboratives have a unique opportunity to respond in all 3 of these waves: the emergency response, the initial recovery, and then this reset and shifting the systems as we come out of COVID. And the reason for that is that collective impact efforts have that collaborative infrastructure already in place. And really importantly, you have those relationships and the strength of relationships that you can rely on to sense what is happening and to respond quickly. One of the analogies that is my favorite around collective impact is birds flocking. So many of you have seen those wonderful creations of birds flocking together in the sky and how quickly they're able to wheel and correct. Well, scientists have told us that a flock of birds can react more than 3 times faster to an external threat than an individual bird. 3 times faster if you're flocking to react to that hawk that's diving at you than if you're an individual bird. And I think that collective impact offers the same structure, relationships, and collaborative structure so that we can react faster when system shocks happen. So as we think about prioritizing in the short term, prioritizing in the medium term, and then prioritizing in the long term, I think there's a real opportunity for us to utilize the relationships and infrastructure that we have in collective impact. In the short term, Paul mentioned Mariana or Kia's strategy triage tool, which is just a fantastic tool for folks to use. Having your group come together to use that tool in the short term is really useful, and perhaps defining some key criteria that you're using to prioritize what comes first. And some of the criteria that we've seen collective impact efforts using are: what is the need? What do we know that our communities need most now? What do we have to offer in terms of the assets that our collective impact effort can bring? And importantly, what capacity do we have? I think capacity is varying dramatically right now. People that are, in the healthcare sphere, people that are working in food banks have no capacity at all beyond what they're doing right now. But others that are your partners might have quite a lot of capacity to pivot and to work in new ways. Some of the collective impact efforts that we've seen in the short term have been things like putting information out there. The Roadmap Project, which is an education collective impact effort here in Seattle, has a page now that has all the resources that families in that collective impact effort can access, whether it's from public health, whether it's around homelessness resources, whether it's around information from individual school districts in their community. All of that information is in one place for families, and they can access it really easily. We've also seen community collective impact efforts just doing outreach, checking in with partners, checking in with most vulnerable communities to see how people are doing and how they can help. And in some cases, collective impact efforts have been able to mobilize things, to really do things in the short term to help. And frankly, in some cases, you can't do anything. If you are in a place where your partners don't have capacity to react right now in the short term, that is okay too. And we recognize that people are in different places in terms of their capacity and how they can react. So that short-term response, what can we do literally in the short term in the next 6 to 8 weeks, I think is really important to think through. And using the triage tool as well as some criteria can be really helpful. As we move into the recovery phase, that sort of medium term, we've begun to see collective impact efforts doing really interesting things here too in response. And I think one of the really exciting things that we've seen is the number of innovations that are happening across our communities. And these are innovations that are driven, of course, by urgency of need and the ingenuity of the people on the ground. But some of these innovations are incredibly impactful in the short term. I think about in my own school district where school buses, instead of transporting children, are now delivering lunches to families that are most vulnerable and meals. But some of the innovations that we're seeing in our collective impact efforts are actually things that can be leveraged for the long term and can have real impact. And so there's an opportunity for collective impact efforts to identify what those innovations are and to help to scale them up and to help them to continue past this emergency crisis. Some of the examples we've seen, of course, are things like telehealth. So reimbursements have dramatically increased the number of people that can access telehealth for both mental and physical health. That's something that can continue. We've seen a rise of online learning. Of course, many school children have been forced to go onto online learning, my 3 teenagers included. But there are some lessons that can be learned from that and how to do it better. We've also seen universities offering their courses online for free. And these are things that can continue beyond the crisis. In workforce, we're seeing employers now putting up portals for their furloughed workers so that those workers can get access to jobs during this time and jobs that are in urgent need. Those are things that could potentially last beyond this crisis. They might be opportunities for people to find jobs, to create more economic mobility, to get a better job over time. So these job portals are really interesting innovations that we're seeing. And then I think volunteering, virtual volunteering. One of the collective impact efforts that we work with on the East Coast is focused on aging. And one of the things that they've been able to do is their volunteers can't go and visit elderly people in their homes because of COVID, but because of technology, they can reach them virtually. And by blocking the number of the person the caregiver that's calling, those people can actually do that virtual volunteering and outreach to elderly folks from home, rather than having to be in the nonprofit or in a call center. And that's led to a dramatic increase in virtual volunteering for this collective impact effort. So there are many, many innovations that I'm sure that we're all seeing in our work. And this is the opportunity to lift those up, to scale them, and to continue them past the crisis. And then the last piece, which I will touch on, and that I think Junious has done such a beautiful job of lifting up for all of us, is this reset. This is the opportunity for us to reset as we come out of the COVID crisis. The fact is that it has laid bare the inequities that are so deep in our society, and so clearly along racial lines, many kinds of inequities, but certainly racial inequity. And it's now exacerbating those inequities. And so this is a real opportunity for us to recognize that these inequities do not exist because of individual behaviors. These inequities exist because of the ingrained systems and the institutions that perpetuate them. And this is an opportunity for us in our collective impact efforts to really reset around how do we shift those systems? How do we advocate for policies that will really help, like universal health care, living wage? How do we shift the power dynamics to allow more voice of those who are most impacted to be at the decision-making tables? How do we, really shift the mental models about who has value in our society? And I would encourage folks to check out a new blog from our colleagues at PolicyLink. Angela Glover-Blackwell and Michael McAfee just wrote an incredible blog about human value and the COVID, which really talks about how we value all people in our society and create opportunities for them to thrive. So there's a real opportunity to reset. And I would just say, how lucky are we that we have this collective impact infrastructure in place to be able to respond in the short term, in the medium term, and in the long term.
Thanks, Faye. I appreciate you adding that, and this notion of not just restarting but resetting. It does align well with what you've put forward here, Junious, particularly in the outer rings of this visual. I'm going to take the slide share off and move us into a continued Q&A, and I've got a few questions. Some of these were based on helpful questions that were asked from those of you in advance, but feel free, as you all are hearing this conversation, if there's other questions that you all have real time, feel free to add them to the question and answer box. First of all, I just wanted, Junious or Paul, do you have anything that, just hearing Faye describe the kind of opportunities in the short term, intermediate and long term, anything you would add to what she just said?
I would just add a comment that I appreciate the things that you noted as things to continue, but for me, it's the big ticket items, like covering everybody's health care that we're going to have to do around the COVID testing and treatment. It should be universal. And therefore, I'm personally focused on the big structural pieces. A guaranteed income for everybody, not universal, but a guaranteed basic level that we seem to be moving for. It seems to me that those are some of the big structural pieces that if we get right, what's happening in the grocery store industry with respect to those temporary raises, where after having achieved $15 an hour Target, Safeway, several other retailers are now up to 17, and workers are demanding even more money. And those are the sort of things that I think I'm most interested in. I think everything helps, but if we can get at some of these structural pieces and convince everybody that's in our collective best interest to just have these things become permanent, that we'll all be better as a result of it. So, and who knows what else we're going to end up doing as the reality of the length of the pandemic crisis really settles on us.
Yeah. Thanks, Junious.
And I'm good. I loved it, and want to make sure we get to questions, and think it's really
good.
Happy to be with everyone today.
One question that came through in advance, which I even thought about this as I was opening up this session, and I'm sure those of you have experienced this too, about how we strike the right tone, just acknowledging that you don't want to come across as kind of glossing over the pain and the challenge that people are facing right now. And so we'd love to hear, anyone can take this, just how do you adjust your collaborative's emails or other communications to show support and just acknowledge what's real and hitting that right tone. So not only in the communication, but also maybe even when you're having a virtual meeting, how you set that container, set that space.
I found it important, again, just to continue to check in, to give people permission to not be okay, and I don't mean that like I've got power to give, but like just like sometimes people are worried, like, can they be vulnerable in a space, and just creating that space that people can be and acknowledging it. I think that, and being careful about our privilege within communications and how we speak. Not everyone is in the same situation right now in terms of physical space, in terms of health, in terms of income, in terms of all these things. And sometimes we can take things for granted. I've been on a couple calls that I found really tone deaf, that also approached all of this very technically and got really into like excited about talking about like the work without acknowledging the pain behind the work. And I just think really holding that space, opening with space to acknowledge it, remembering not to say, have a great day. Because like it's hard for a lot of people to kind of process that. And I'd love if people, and even some of the comments, can share some things they've used maybe in their email sign-offs or other things that they find helpful. And in the blog post, I talked a lot about Brene Brown's empathy work and just kind of being present in that and acknowledging the feelings people are having. But I think that's one of the best things we can do.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul. One other question, it came through in advance and it actually just emerged in some of the comments happening in the chat sidebar is, how do we go about connecting and reaching individuals that might actually not be online or cannot get online during this era, this time of physical distancing, or they just may not have access to broadband? I'm thinking, Faye, even about like some of those medium-term opportunities, which do represent real potential. A lot of them kind of presuppose internet access. So it makes me wonder, like, how do we take that into account? And that could be for urban or rural settings, but I'd love to hear your all's thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I've seen some folks on actually on the chat mentioning that broadband and access to broadband is a critical sort of part of the system reset, and I would totally agree with that. We see technology as being a great enabler for change, but if there isn't access to technology, that's a serious problem. And it again is a big inequity, right? So I think that is something that we should all be advocating for. And then for folks that don't have access to internet, which is many folks, I would add, in rural and in urban communities, I think we do have the situation where most people do have phones. And so I've certainly seen collective impact efforts where if they aren't able to reach people through internet or through, those kinds of things, that they can do one-on-one outreach through phone. And so that's sort of, and it's important to do that. It's important to check in with people and to see how they're doing. But I don't know if others, Junious or Paul, if you guys have seen other techniques where folks don't have access to the internet.
One other thing I'll add, I just heard this yesterday talking to a backbone leader in Florida, and it actually relates, Faye, to your example of what the collaborative in Washington State is doing around just getting information out. So beyond having an online set of resources, which Tracy, by the way, if those of you earlier can look in the thread, she shared that link that they put together with CCER. This group in Florida, they decided, because they knew within the community that they're serving that something that was provided electronically may not actually reach everyone. They decided to, in kind of rapid response mode, they pulled together the most trusted resources around food, around childcare, and some of the other resources that were available, and they printed out a flyer and got it in the mail, which does not address the broader structural issue about how people can use technology to access future jobs and things like that, but at least is not just assuming that email newsletters and websites are going to be the only mode in which people communicate. So I just thought that was another good example. And I think it also came up because he was saying this falls definitely in the category of this is emergency times. We probably normally wouldn't have that be the first thing that we're prioritizing, but I think they kind of went through a similar, developing criteria like you had said, and say this is actually something we have the capacity and ability to get this out, and it'll be really helpful to the community that we serve. Yeah, one other question, and feel free others to add your questions as we go here, that I wanted to follow up on. Junious, you had spoke to this in the kind of outer rings of the slide around equity, and how many collaboratives will need to recalibrate around equity. Any additional thoughts you have about how to build conviction among partners during this time that equity should be the focus? I mean, you spoke to some of this already, but just any other guidance you would have if people are either being met with resistance or there's kind of variations in levels of conviction, how to address that. You're still on mute, Junious.
Tough one, sorry. It's a tough one, but I think right now the biggest issue, and it's been revealed by the lack of data that were originally available with respect to gender, racial, ethnic breakdowns in terms of those who are being tested or who were infected, hospitalized, or died. And I make that point because I thought we were well past the issue of our ability and willingness to collect data, and it seems as though we weren't. And I would give compliments to some of the Government Alliance for Racial Equity cities, like Milwaukee, who consistently collected the data and were really leaders and pioneers in saying something's going on here around race and causing the kind of natural uproar. I raise that issue because we're not going to do much of anything if we're not committed to getting the data to let us know what's going on. So I think one of the things early on is for people in collective impact initiatives to advocate for the collection of good demographic data about what's going on within their communities, so that you can identify where there are some patterns of disparities that we need to address and engage people from those communities in figuring out what the most appropriate interventions or responses are to the circumstances that some groups and communities find themselves in. But I think that is so foundational, and it really caused me pause when I started looking for racial data 2 or 3 weeks ago and couldn't find any, to say, have we gone nowhere? And what we thought was embedded, which is this like baseline commitment to collecting data, wasn't nearly as universal as we thought. So that would be my thing, is demand that healthcare professionals, and as we move into some of the emergency relief, we have to be steadfast in our commitment to getting people to collect the data so we know how things are happening and we know where there are points of pain and there are points of success. And both of those, because we need some encouraging victories as we go along, and those are going to come from data. As we've seen in terms of all the data related to flattening the curve, that's been an encouragement to stay the course and that we're doing the right thing. And that's all data driven. People can see those charts and graphs and saying, okay, we made an impact. So.
Thanks, Junious. Paul, anything you would add on that point around? Yeah, go ahead, Junious.
One other quick one. There is an article that John Powell wrote today that was published, at least in our local newspaper here in Oakland, about targeted universalism and the COVID virus, that I think is worth going through, because he goes through an analysis process of how you apply principles of a targeted universalism to the crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think it's worth it because he kind of goes concretely through some stages of analysis. And my point is to action. It does us nothing to know what the patterns are if we're not committed to saying, yes, there is a population here that we're concerned about the disparities, and we're going to go in and do something specifically to relieve the pain and suffering that a particular group is experienced as reflected in the data.
That's great. I'm so glad there's several other resources that have come up. The policy link piece, which I saw Tracy posted, we'll do our best to find the Powell article as well. For those of you that attended our convening last year, John Powell was one of our keynotes, and we have a great archived recording of that around the role of equity and belonging and collective impact, which I feel like is more relevant now than ever based on this conversation today. One thing that came up in the chat box, which I'd love to ask you all, is how you personally or how you're seeing organizations and collaboratives deal with Zoom fatigue. I know personally, I think this is my 6th Zoom call already today. I started off with a lot of 30-minute Zoom calls, but at least this one's on webinar, so it's a little bit of a different feel. But yeah, I'd love to hear how you all are managing that.
Yeah,
one thing I'll share, one thing that I did actually on an earlier call today, especially if it's a larger Zoom call, this was, and I picked up this idea from it was a Wall Street Journal piece about Zoom fatigue that came out, I think 2 weeks ago. And they said that if it's calls where there actually are many faces, where it's actually not that important that you're on video the whole time, like just take it via audio. I mean, you don't have to be on video, and go for a walk when you're on that call. Or if it's a point where you need to speak up at a certain point. I know some people might be limited by their data plans, but you have the ability to take a Zoom call while you're out and about. I realize some people can't physically leave their home, so that's not really an option. But even just not being at your computer, if it's Zoom back to back to back, that was one thing that someone mentioned. Yeah, I don't know if there's any other strategies that you've tried.
I think you're hearing a pause because so many of us have Zoom fatigue. So it's real. But I would say it's also just lucky that we have the chance to see each other. So I really value the chance to see, colleagues and friends and family. I haven't seen anyone other than my immediate family members for over a month at this point. So there's some value in that. I would also say that, we certainly at FSG have used other platforms as well, whether it's murals, I know is something that we've used, which allows you to do sort of more interactive things. If you have a large Zoom call, using breakout groups can be really helpful because it just gets into smaller conversations, which I think tend to be more productive. And I think, sort of having fun with Zoom a little bit too. I mean, we've actually had colleagues at FSG that have used Zoom to play games together or do karaoke or just to hang out, not just to use Zoom for serious business meetings, but to use it for social interaction and building of relationships, which is more important than ever in this time. So I think that there are ways to sort of break up the monotony of back-to-back, very serious Zoom calls as well.
That's great. I love some of the things that people are mentioning in the chat space, such as like the days with lots of Zoom calls, not planning any other work that day just for energy's sake, scheduling 50 minutes, not doing more than 50 minutes on the hour to give everyone a break. If you've got hourly ones, like giving yourself those breaks that are important. I think there's a lot of good things that people are coming up with. I personally haven't been fatigued by it. I mean, I'm enjoying doing the work, frankly, and connecting with people, and that's and this is the way to do it. So I guess I've kind of just accepted that, but recognize that not every meeting needs to be a Zoom meeting, and there's definitely meetings I've done by phone. There's meetings I've done without video. There's large meetings where it doesn't make sense to do it that way. And so I think also just really right sizing it, but with smaller teams, I think it can be helpful just to have that greater connection. But I think also I've been on calls with people who've opted out and been clear why they're out, and just not like with an excuse as much, but just saying like, I'm going to opt out of the video for this call. I hope that's okay. And everyone's like, yes. And so if you do need to opt out of video, just let people know. Recognize that being on video allows people to connect to you a little more, but don't be afraid or feel awkward about asking for, right now, I need a little more space. And I think that's cool.
Yeah, I would add one other thing, which is to recognize that this was a very different dynamic that when it was coupled with face-to-face kinds of meetings. And now that we're exclusively in kind of virtual or audio space, I think we need to give ourselves some time, and I would hope that people who are leading collaboratives or leading meetings, part of what I'm doing is going through a bunch of materials to study how to be more effective as a facilitator in meetings when they are not coupled with some face-to-face contact. My workshop materials, my meeting facilitation, just going through and learning how to be better with the use of this technology, that hopefully as we get a little further in this and as people learn to be better at it, I think there's going to be less fatigue because we will learn to effectively use the tools. And even some of the things that people have mentioned already, when that comes together, I think we'll get better at this and there'll be less fatigue because we'll be more judicious in our use of some of the technology and better at how we do meetings and learning with the tools.
Yeah, one thing, I know, Paul, you've done sessions before on making meetings effective and making them interactive. I'm curious if you've thought about adapting that for a virtual setting. I mean, there are definitely a lot of other resources, to your point, Junious, that are coming out on effective meeting facilitation. And Faye, you spoke to one strategy which does seem to help, is if you're trying to facilitate a virtual meeting of 10 or more people, just like you would in any in-person meeting, finding a way to break the group up into smaller chunks still feels like very much a best practice. But are there other things, Paul, that you think about in terms of opening prompts or other things that throughout a meeting to kind of, whenever I've seen you facilitate in particular, you're always good about kind of lifting the room's energy. So have you found ways to do that?
Yes,
virtually?
I try to lift the group's energy. No, I do think a couple things. One is always be clear about what are we trying to walk out of this meeting with? What are the results we're trying to walk out with? Don't do a meeting to do a meeting. People don't need more meetings right now. Be clear about what we're trying to walk out with. Create space for people to check in. Facilitation's always active. Someone should facilitate the meeting and not have it be a group, like it's hard to facilitate. Someone should be the facilitator. And yes, the energy you bring as facilitator will affect the energy of the group that you're facilitating. So like, don't do it from here, but be present and be upfront. And so I think that would be helpful. When we do the Make Meetings Work session, I was going to do at the conference in May in person, which was based on meetings in person, is going to be online, and I'm going to be adapting it. So I haven't really fully done that yet. I'm still learning my way through it, but I'll be talking about virtual ways to do it. But I think some of the basic practices of like clear results, active facilitation, call on people, don't create dead air, and hold energy in the group is important. And it can be tiring, but especially for people who are backboning efforts, try to keep that energy in the group and keep it moving.
I think I'll maybe ask one last question, and it kind of comes back to, Faye, your kind of short-term, medium, long-term frame. Just any tips that you all have on self-care or thinking about ways that we lean into this work, acknowledging that there's still a long road ahead just on the emergency side. I saw a comment that, the getting to recovery and getting to reset is going to be, we look forward to that moment, but we're not in it yet. And so how do you kind of how are you all kind of balancing and retaining energy for the now and still having, energy for the future?
It's a hard one to answer. I'll go first just because I realized I was off mic. It's a hard one to answer. I think I've been really trying to take things a day at a time, and also recognize that this is not hold the false hope that like in June everything's going to be normal. to recognize this is going to last a while. And I think really being honest about those kind of brutal facts, recognize we will work through this, but not get overwhelmed by it, can be a tricky balance to hold. In my case, I had 13 gigs canceled initially, and a lot of work changed and canceled, and it's been difficult. But I think the big thing is just trying to plan for what we do know, which is that this is going to last a while. Understand how work has to change and start adapting to it, and not just thinking, oh, by June we'll be bringing groups of 100 people into a room. You're probably not. Maybe in some places, but probably not. And so I think just, again, take care of yourself. In the blog area, I talk about put on your oxygen mask first, build routines and healthy things you can do for yourself. And then I think just try to take it a day at a time as you can. But I think building healthy habits and routines is also important.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that, Paul. And I so appreciate all the advice you've actually been giving on this topic in the last calls. I think it's been really helpful. I think that just sort of recognizing that we are experiencing individual and collective deep anxiety and trauma is important. And creating the space for that, I think, is really important too, both for ourselves and for others. And I think that translates both into like self-care and giving yourself the time and the space that you need in whatever way that might look. But I think it also requires, in addition to self-care, taking the time to check in personally with your friends and your colleagues and your partners, because everyone's going through this in some way, shape, or form. And I think keeping that in mind, as much as you want to get to the work and get things done, and all of us, I think, are doers, right? We care about social impact, we care about systems change, and we want that more than anything. I think it's really important to take the time to remember that we're all human and we're experiencing this together, and that personal connection is just as important now, and maybe the place to start, as the action. They're both important, but just keeping the space for that and the personal connection, I think, is really, really critical now.
Thanks, Faye. Appreciate you sharing. And Junious, something you had shared last week on self-care, which I appreciated, was the prioritize calling someone that every day, like making sure that if you're not interacting with someone in your home, or just to get outside of yourself and to connect with other people, something I've been trying to do day in and day out. So thank you all so much. I know we're nearing the hour here. I'm going to pull my slides back up because I had a few other final announcements before we wrap up. Junious, I know this was a slide that we won't have time to present in detail, but it will be in the downloads for folks if you want to reference some additional teleconferencing resources. I should have pulled this up when someone had asked the question about just other ways that people are engaging. So just some video conferencing tips. Junious, thanks for pulling that together, and feel free, folks offline, to take a look at these links that'll be in the downloads. Someone had asked about the downloads. We will be sharing the recording of this and the download, the recording of this conversation and the materials today. Also wanted to let you all know that Tracy's going to post a link to the attendee survey, which is going to be in the chat box just now, which would be great if you could take 2 minutes right now just to fill that out. That's going to be a great opportunity just to provide feedback. We just really appreciate your suggestions throughout this series. I also wanted to just thank Junious and Paul and Faye for your time today. I always learn so much from you all, and I really appreciated having the privilege of all of you together today. The other thing I wanted to just quickly put on everyone's radar, which we referenced a few times already today, but if you're not registered for this virtual convening, it's coming up May 6th through the 8th. We're excited to have over 30 sessions. They're going to be offered virtually. Paul and Junious are going to be leading sessions. Faye will be involved as well. We're getting the whole FSG and Aspen team helping out this year. So we'd love to see you all there for that. And then also we're excited to share the Collective Impact Forum podcast, which is now up to, I think, 9 or more episodes. It's a combination of some of our best of sessions in the past, as well as some more practical how-to oriented topics. And it's been exciting to see several thousand people already access the podcast over the last few weeks. So thank you again for joining us today. It was just really life-giving for me and energizing to hear your questions and to hear our speakers' comments, and hope you all have a great rest of the day and great rest of the week. And please do prioritize self-care and time with your family and friends, and be well. Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.